The summer heat was pressing down on the neighborhood when everything started. And if you're here for another unbelievable HOA Karen story, you won't want to miss this one, because what began with me installing a simple smart lock on my private pool fence spiraled into trespassing lies, and even a 911 call that left Karen's son frozen in shock when the truth came out. So make sure you stick through this entire story, because it's one you'll never forget. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories so you never miss the wildest HOA dramas we bring to life. Because trust me, this one has it all. From entitled neighbors to the law stepping in to set things straight. It all began when Brian, decided I'd had enough of Karen and her family treating my private pool like it was some kind of community amenity. For years, I'd tolerated their excuses, Karen claiming her son needed a place to cool off, or that the HOA rules said the pool should be open to residents, even though it was on my property and paid for entirely with my own money. Finally decided to install a smart lock system on my pool gate, one that only I and my family could access, controlled by a code on my phone. The day I installed it, I felt a sense of relief, knowing that finally I'd have some peace. But Karen, of course, noticed within hours. She came stomping across the yard, her arms waving like she was directing traffic, yelling about how I had no right to restrict access to something she claimed belonged to the neighborhood. I calmly explained to her that it was my property. I had every right to secure it, and that from now on, only my family would be swimming there. Her face turned red, her voice went shrill, and she threatened to take this to the board. I shrugged it off, because the board already knew the pool was mine and not under their control. But I underestimated just how far Karen and her family would go. The very next day, while I was at work, I got a notification on my phone from the smart lock systems. Someone was trying to force the gate open. I checked the camera feed, and sure enough, there was Karen's teenage son, Tyler, yanking on the fence and fiddling with the lock like he was trying to break into Fort Knox. I called my wife to check on things, and by the time she went outside, Tyler was yelling at her, demanding she give him the code. He claimed the HOA said he could use the pool anytime he wanted, and when my wife refused, he actually threatened to call the police. My wife laughed it off, but a couple hours later, the situation escalated. I came home early that evening, only to find police cars parked outside my house. My heart sank, thinking something terrible had happened. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw Karen standing smugly next to her son Tyler, who was dramatically pointing at my pool gate as if he were presenting evidence of some crime. The officers approached me as I got out of my car, asking if I had recently blocked access to a community amenity. I nearly laughed out loud but held my composure, explaining that the pool was not a community amenity, but my private property, and I had all the paperwork to prove it. Karen immediately interrupted, screaming that I was lying, that the pool had been open for years, and that by installing the lock, I was endangering the children of the neighborhood who relied on it to stay safe from the heat. The officers remained calm, but I could see in their eyes that they weren't buying her act. They asked for proof of ownership, so I invited them inside, retrieved the deed documents and property maps, and laid everything out for them. The moment they saw it, they nodded, realizing Karen and her son had wasted their time. But Tyler, desperate not to look foolish, started raising his voice, insisting that I was withholding community property. The officers warned him to lower his tone, but he just kept going. And that's when he made his biggest mistake. He admitted right in front of the cops that he had been trying to break into the pool gate earlier that day. The officers' expressions changed instantly. One of them turned to him and said, "Son, do you realize that's trespassing?" Karen tried to jump in, insisting he was just a kid and didn't know better. But Tyler was 17, old enough to know exactly what he was doing, and the police weren't amused. They told Karen and her son that if they ever set foot on my property again without permission, they'd be facing charges. Karen's face went pale, and Tyler, who had been acting so bold, suddenly froze, realizing he was the one in the wrong. But as much as I thought that warning would be enough, Karen wasn't done yet. In her mind, this was now a war, and if she couldn't use the pool through bullying or fake rules, she was going to find another way to try and make my life miserable. I just didn't know then how far she'd go, or that this story was only just beginning. The warning from the police should have been the end of it, but with Karen, nothing is ever that simple. And I learned very quickly that when she feels embarrassed, she comes back twice as hard, because a woman like her doesn't back down. Doubles down. The very next morning, before I even had a chance to leave for work, I noticed her pacing back and forth on the sidewalk in front of my house, glaring at the pool fence as though she were trying to burn holes through the lock with her eyes. I tried to ignore her, but the moment I got in my truck, she marched over, waving her phone in my face. Wow, telling me that she had spoken to several board members, who all agreed that my smart lock was a violation of community accessibility bylaws. I asked her to show me those bylaws, and of course, she couldn't, because they didn't exist. Still, she wasn't backing down. She said her son felt traumatized by how the police treated him and that owed them an apology and restored access to the pool. I told her the only apology that needed to be made was from her son for trying to break in, and I drove off before she could say more. Later that day, I got an email from the HOA demanding I remove any unauthorized security installations and allow the pool to remain open for community use. My blood boiled because I knew Karen had stirred them up with lies, but instead of reacting with anger, I replied with attached scans of my property deed and proof that the pool had always been private. I even CC'd the police report from the night before. A couple of hours later, the HOA president himself called me too. Apologized, admitting Karen had filed a complaint that made it sound like I was barricading a shared facility. He promised to straighten things out with the rest of the board, but I could tell he was weary of Karen's constant meddling. When I got home that evening, though, it was clear Karen wasn't planning to give up. My smart lock camera pinged again, and when I checked, I saw not only Tyler, but also two of his friends, hopping my back fence and sprinting toward the pool. I rushed out, yelling for them to leave, and they scattered like startled deer, laughing as if it were all a game. Minutes later, Karen came storming down the street, shouting at me for harassing kids and ruining their summer. I pointed at the camera still recording and told her I had evidence of trespassing and that if it happened again, I'd press charges. She went quiet for a moment, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She wasn't going to stop. Over the next few days, it became a pattern. My cameras caught Tyler and his buddies trying to sneak in multiple times, sometimes during the day, sometimes late at night. Each time, the smart lock kept them out, but their persistence drove me crazy. When I confronted Karen about it, she twisted everything around, claiming the boys had nowhere else safe to go and that I was being heartless. I told her there was a public pool less than 5 minutes away, and if she wanted her son to swim, she should take him there. That only made her angrier. Then one evening, I came home to find a notice taped to my front door, another complaint from the HOA, this time citing nuisance reports made by Karen about noise, legal modifications, and even endangering the community. She had filed complaint after complaint, trying to bury me under paperwork and frustration until I gave in. What she didn't realize, though, was that I wasn't just going to sit back and take it. I started documenting everything: videos of Tyler trespassing, audio of Karen screaming, copies of every complaint, and my responses. I organized it all into a thick file, ready to defend myself at the next HOA meeting. But Karen didn't wait for that meeting. The following weekend, while my family and I were enjoying a quiet evening swim, Karen marched straight up to the gate with her son, rattled the fence, and screamed that we were abusing power. When I told her to leave, she pulled out her phone and told Tyler, right in front of me, to call 911 because a dangerous man was blocking them from entering. I was stunned at her audacity. But when the call connected and Tyler started telling the operator that I was locking children out of a shared pool, I realized things had just escalated to a level I hadn't expected. Within minutes, sirens echoed down the street again, and the neighbors began gathering, whispering about the drama unfolding right in front of their eyes. What Karen didn't realize was that this time I was fully prepared and her lies weren't going to save her. When the police arrived that night, the scene was already tense. Neighbors clustered on their lawns with folded arms, watching as if it were their evening entertainment. Karen clutching her phone and pretending to cry while Tyler pointed at me and shouted that I had stolen the neighborhood pool. And me standing inside my fenced yard with the smart locks camera still blinking red, recording every second. The officers, 2 of them this time, approached cautiously, asking what was going on. When before I could say a word, Karen launched into her tirade about how I had changed the locks on community property and was denying access to children, pointing at Tyler and his friends as her proof. I calmly pulled out my phone, opened the app connected to the smart lock, and showed the officers not just the camera feed, but also the property deed that marked the pool as mine alone, explaining that Karen and her son had been trespassing repeatedly, despite warnings and a police report already on file. The officers glanced at one another, then at Karen, and I could see the shift in their expressions. They weren't buying her story this time. One officer asked Karen directly if she had any documentation proving the pool was community-owned, and when she stammered and deflected, they turned back to me. I pulled up the saved clips of Tyler and his friends hopping my fence and rattling the lock, including one from just an hour before, and showed them. Karen's face turned red, and she started yelling at Tyler for filming things the wrong way, as though it was his fault that my cameras caught them in the act. The officers told her in no uncertain terms that if she or her son were caught trespassing again, there would be arrests, and that the lock on my private pool was entirely legal. That should have been the end of it. But instead of backing down, Karen became more desperate. The very next day, the HOA president called me to say that Karen had demanded an emergency board meeting to address the smart lock situation. I attended, file folder in hand, while Karen stormed in with Tyler at her side, loudly declaring that my lock was a violation of the community's spirit of openness. When I presented my documentation, the deed, the police reports, and the camera footage, most of the board members nodded in agreement with me, clearly embarrassed by Karen's antics. The president told her plainly that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my pool and that she needed to stop harassing me. Karen's eyes flashed with rage, and she turned to glare at me as though I'd humiliated her in front of the entire neighborhood. From that moment, I knew she was going to make things personal. Sure enough, within a week, strange things started happening. I'd wake up to find trash tossed over my fence, my mail missing from the box, and even graffiti scrawled on the side of my shed. My cameras didn't catch Karen directly, but they did catch Tyler and his friends lurking nearby more than once. And though I sent the footage to the police, they warned me it wasn't enough to press charges unless I caught them red-handed. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down on her smear campaign, telling neighbors that I was weaponizing technology against children and turning the neighborhood into a prison. A few people believed her, and I started noticing cold stares from folks who used to wave. It was exhausting, and my family felt like we were living under siege. One night, I caught Tyler again, trying to climb the fence. And this time I went outside with my phone recording, confronting him directly. He froze, then bolted down the street, but not before I clearly caught his face on camera. I sent the footage to the police again, demanding action. They told me they'd escalate it, and a few days later, an officer stopped by to tell me they'd issued a formal warning to Karen and Tyler about harassment and trespassing. But instead of cooling down, Karen seemed emboldened, and one evening, as I drove home, I saw her standing in her driveway shouting at another neighbor that I was hoarding resources, endangering kids with dangerous tech locks. It all came to a head when Tyler once again called 911, this time claiming I had locked him inside the pool area and threatened him. I was stunned when police knocked on my door that night, saying they had to investigate a report of me detaining a minor. Luckily, I had the perfect defense. My cameras showed the gate locked, Tyler rattling it from the outside and me nowhere near him. When I showed the officers the footage, their patience with Karen seemed to run out completely, they told me. They'd be filing a report for false 911 calls, and that, if it happened again, there could be serious consequences. Karen, though, wasn't finished. She began telling anyone who would listen that I was targeting her family, that Tyler was being psychologically abused by being denied pool access, and that I was not the kind of neighbor this community deserved. Some neighbors avoided me, others whispered, but a few quietly pulled me aside to say they were sick of Karen's antics and grateful I was standing up to her. Still, the tension kept building, And the more Karen realized she was losing ground, the more reckless she became. What I didn't know yet was that the biggest storm was still coming, and the next time Karen involved the police, it wouldn't just be an inconvenience, it would threaten to upend everything. The storm I feared hit just a week later when I was out mowing my front yard, headphones on, trying to block out the stress that had become routine in my life thanks to Karen and her son. When suddenly 3 squad cars came screeching down the street, lights flashing, sirens blaring, pulling right up to my driveway as though I were some sort of criminal mastermind. I shut the mower off in shock, pulled out my earbuds. And before I could even ask what was happening, I found myself being ordered to put my hands where they could see them. Neighbors poured out of their houses, cameras out, whispering and gawking. And then Karen came storming down her driveway, pointing at me and shrieking to the officers that I had assaulted her son with a pool tool, and that Tyler had been trapped and beaten on my property. My heart dropped into my stomach as I realized this was Karen's most elaborate fabrication yet. And the fact that so many officers were dispatched told me she had dialed 911 screaming bloody murder. I raised my hands and calmly told the officers that everything they needed to know was on my smart lock's video feed, but Karen wasn't letting up. Crying hysterically and telling them Tyler was traumatized and needed medical attention, one officer pulled me aside while another went to speak with Tyler, who was dramatically holding his arm as though it were broken, though I noticed he never let go of his cell phone. I hurried inside, grabbed my phone, and pulled up the exact camera angle covering the pool fence. It showed Tyler climbing over the fence, falling clumsily on the ground, and getting up and pretending to limp before running to his mother's house. At no point was I even outside, much less near him. When the officer reviewed the footage, his demeanor changed instantly, and I could tell he was tired of being dragged into this circus. He marched over to Karen, showed her the footage, and told her in no uncertain terms that filing false police reports was a crime, and that her son had not only trespassed again, but fabricated an injury. Karen's face twisted with rage, and she tried to pivot, claiming the lock itself was dangerous and that my pool was a menace to the community. But the officers weren't buying it anymore. One of them even warned her that if this behavior continued, Child Protective Services might be contacted to evaluate what exactly she was teaching Tyler by encouraging these lies. Karen went pale at that, but she still refused to apologize or back down. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that finally, after being publicly humiliated and warned by police, Karen would give up her campaign against me. But instead, she doubled down in quieter, more insidious ways. I noticed more graffiti, showing up, this time reading "Pool Stealer" scrawled across my mailbox, and someone began leaving piles of dog waste right at my gate. Tyler and his friends started riding their bikes back and forth past my house, shouting insults and daring me to come outside. My family began to feel like prisoners in our own home, and my wife suggested we consider selling the house, just to get away from Karen's insanity. I hated that she was driving us to that point, especially since the pool and the yard were a dream come true for us, something we had worked so hard for. I promised my wife I would find a way to put an end to it, legally and permanently. I started keeping a daily log of every incident, every trespass, every bit of harassment, attaching timestamps, screenshots, and video clips. I contacted a lawyer to discuss the possibility of a restraining order against Karen and Tyler, and he told me it was absolutely possible if I could show a pattern of harassment and false police reports. Meanwhile, Karen was busy holding court with her little circle of friends in the neighborhood, spreading rumors that I was mentally unstable and a danger to children. Some people seemed to believe her, but more and more others were beginning to see through the lies. A few neighbors quietly came by to tell me they supported me, that they were tired of Karen causing chaos in the HOA, and that they were ready to back me up if things escalated. That support became crucial one evening when Karen staged her boldest stunt yet. She marched Tyler and 2 of his friends up to my pool fence in broad daylight, demanding I unlock it so the community kids could swim. I was inside watching through the cameras, and instead of going out there, I called the police myself. When the officers arrived, Karen once again tried to play the victim, yelling about how I was hoarding the pool, but this time not only did my cameras show the truth. But several neighbors stepped forward to tell the officers they had seen Karen and Tyler trespassing and vandalizing my property over the past few weeks. With witnesses, video, and police reports stacked against her, Karen's narrative began to crumble. The officers warned her again that she was inches away from facing charges, and that her son's behavior was entirely her responsibility. But Karen wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully. The more cornered she became, the more erratic her actions grew. She stopped talking to me directly and instead started pushing Tyler into the spotlight, letting him be the one to shout at me, to provoke me, to call 911. It was a dangerous game. I knew it was only a matter of time before she crossed a line that couldn't be ignored any longer. What I didn't realize was how soon that moment would come. More how explosive it would be when it did. The next few days after the police left were tense. The kind of tension where every sound outside made me check my cameras twice, and every knock on the door made my stomach tighten. Because even though the officers had warned Karen and Tyler to stay away, I knew neither of them respected boundaries, and it was only a matter of time before they tried something else. I wasn't wrong. On the third evening, just as I was sitting with my daughter by the pool, proud that she finally felt safe enough to swim again, I noticed a shadow moving along the side fence, too tall and deliberate to be just a passing neighbor, and when I checked the cameras, there was Tyler, phone in one hand, tugging at the gate with the other, clearly trying to see if the smart lock had somehow failed, or if he could slip in again. This time, though, the lock held firm. Solid click reminding him that he wasn't welcome here. But instead of leaving, he stood there, glaring into the yard like he owned it, before finally raising his phone and taking pictures of me and my daughter as if he planned to twist them into more evidence for his mother's endless complaints. My blood boiled, but instead of reacting and giving him fuel, I calmly called the non-emergency police line, reported the trespassing, and let the cameras roll. By the time an officer arrived, Tyler had run back toward his house, but the officer saw the footage I pulled up on my phone and promised that this would be added to the growing file against the family. Karen, of course, came storming out shortly after, yelling at the officer that I was harassing her son and criminalizing a child for wanting to swim. The officer didn't buy it, not this time, and calmly explained that Tyler wasn't welcome on my property, that this was no longer a community pool but a private one, since I paid for the maintenance and lock, and that her continued harassment could lead to charges. Karen's face turned beet red, her mouth working faster than her brain as she accused me of brainwashing the whole neighborhood against her. But when the officer finally drove off, she shot me one last venomous glare and hissed, "You'll regret this." That night, I couldn't shake her words, and though I tried to reassure my daughter that everything was fine, inside I kept running scenarios of what Karen might attempt next. I knew people like her didn't stop when the law pushed back. They escalated. And sure enough, I didn't have to wait long to be proven right. The following morning, as I was heading to work, I found a notice taped to my door, one that bore the HOA's letterhead but clearly looked doctored. It accused me of illegally restricting community access, and demanded I remove the smart lock within 48 hours or face fines and legal action. My hands trembled as I read it, not because I believed it, but because I recognized Karen's handiwork in every word, the same exaggerated phrasing, the same self-righteous tone. And when I reached out to the actual HOA president, he confirmed what I suspected: the letter was fake. He sounded exasperated, telling me I wasn't the first neighbor to complain about Karen's forged notices, and he advised me to keep the letter as evidence while the board considered formally censuring her. This was a small victory, but it didn't erase the fear, because if Karen was willing to fake official letters, what else might she do? The answer came 2 nights later, and it came with flashing red and blue lights once again. Around 9 o'clock, just as I was finishing dinner, there was a loud banging on my front door, the kind of pounding that makes your chest seize. I opened it cautiously, only to be met by 2 police officers, hands on their holsters, asking if I was armed and demanding I step outside. Confused and alarmed, I complied. And that's when they told me they'd received a 911 call from a young man claiming I had locked children inside the pool area and was refusing to let them out. My jaw dropped as I realized Tyler had done it again. I weaponized 911 in a dangerous game just to get me in trouble. Luckily, the officers weren't reckless. They listened as I showed them live footage from my pool camera, which clearly displayed an empty pool, no children, no one trapped, just calm water glistening under the patio lights. One officer shook his head, muttering about false reports wasting time and resources. And he warned me that if Tyler or Karen kept this up, there would be real consequences. Still, the incident left me rattled. If the officers hadn't taken the time to check what could have happened, what if they had burst in with weapons drawn, terrified my daughter, or worse? That wasn't just harassment anymore. It was dangerous, life-threatening behavior. I called my lawyer the next morning and explained everything. From the forged letter, to the repeated trespassing, to the false 911 calls. He listened carefully and then told me it was time to take the next step, filing for a restraining order, and preparing to press charges if necessary. I hesitated at first, knowing it would escalate tensions even more. But as I looked at my daughter eating breakfast with tired eyes from all the disruptions, I realized I had no choice. Karen and Tyler weren't just nuisances, they were threats to our safety, and if I didn't act, they'd never stop. So I agreed, and my lawyer started drafting the paperwork. Meanwhile, I doubled down on security, upgrading the cameras, reinforcing the gate, and even notifying the school about what was happening so they'd know to keep an eye out in case Tyler tried to stir trouble there too. But Karen wasn't done. When she realized her fake letter hadn't worked, and the police weren't buying Tyler's lies, she tried a different tactic, rallying the neighborhood against me. She went door to door, spreading rumors that I was turning the pool into a fortress, that I was endangering children by using unnecessary technology, and even suggesting that I was hiding things in the pool area. Some neighbors avoided her, tired of her antics, but a few seemed swayed, giving me cold looks when I passed. It stung, knowing her poison still had influence. But I reminded myself that the truth was on my side, and as long as I kept my composure, her lies would eventually unravel. The true turning point came when another neighbor, tired of her theatrics, caught her ranting on video and posted it to the community Facebook page. In the clip, Karen screamed about how the pool belongs to me and how I stole access from the children, her words dripping with entitlement. The post went viral within the community, sparking comments from dozens of people finally admitting they'd had similar experiences with her. And suddenly, the tide began to turn. Karen wasn't the victim anymore. She was the bully, and people were seeing it clearly. As empowering as that was, I knew the battle wasn't over. Tyler still lingered near the fence some evenings, still glaring like he was plotting, and Karen continued to bark threats whenever our paths crossed. But now, instead of feeling alone, I felt supported. Neighbors I barely spoke to before stopped by to offer help, to say they were willing to testify if needed, to assure me I wasn't fighting this war by myself. It was a small comfort, but one that meant the world after months of stress. The fifth segment of this nightmare wasn't just about surviving Karen's escalation. It was about realizing that standing firm against her intimidation was working. That no matter how loud she screamed or how many lies she spun, the truth had weight, and slowly but surely, it was crushing her fabricated empire of control. The escalation came faster than I could have imagined, and it happened on a night when the neighborhood was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, and uneventful. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just put my daughter to bed when I noticed movement on my security cameras. At first, I thought it was just a stray animal, but when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There was Tyler, who'd pulled up, carrying something in his hands. Moments later, another figure joined him, and though she tried to stay in the shadows, I recognized Karen instantly. My pulse quickened as I realized what they were doing. Tyler had a crowbar, and Karen was directing him toward the pool gate. They weren't just trespassing this time, they were attempting to break into the smart lock system I had installed. The very thing that started all of this madness. I called 911 immediately, reporting the attempted break-in, but instead of hiding or running, Karen began shouting loud enough for the cameras to pick up her voice, claiming that I had locked her son's belongings inside the pool area, and that they were simply retrieving what was theirs. It was a transparent lie, but I knew the moment police arrived, she'd try to spin the story like she always did. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone, activated the floodlights, and stepped outside, calling out to them from my porch. The sudden blaze of light froze them both, and Tyler dropped the crowbar with a clatter. Karen, however, turned her rage toward me, screaming that I had no right to imprison the community pool and that she was going to prove I was a criminal. She ordered Tyler to grab the lock again, but by then, the red and blue lights were already flashing down the street. The police had arrived quicker than ever before, likely because of the long record tied to Karen and her son. When the officers approached, Karen immediately began her usual performance, throwing herself in front of them, sobbing that I was abusive, that Tyler was just trying to save his things, and that I was the dangerous one. But this time, it wasn't working. The officers went straight to the crowbar lying by the gate, picked it up, and looked directly at Tyler, then at Karen. With disbelief and irritation written all over their faces, I pulled up my live footage on my phone and showed them everything. From the last 10 minutes, Karen directing Tyler wielding the crowbar, their blatant attempt to tamper with my property. My voice shook with a mix of anger and exhaustion as I explained this wasn't the first time that this was a long campaign of harassment, trespassing, and false 911 calls designed to make me look guilty while Karen tried to control my home. The officers didn't even need convincing this time. They had seen enough. One of them told Karen firmly to stop talking, that she was under investigation now for criminal trespass, harassment, and for her role in encouraging Tyler's behavior. Tyler himself was told he could face charges as a juvenile for attempted breaking and entering. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw Karen's mask crack completely. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked pale, frantic, her eyes darting from the officers to me and back as though searching for some escape route. The neighbors started gathering outside their homes, drawn by the flashing lights and the shouting. I could hear whispers traveling. Quickly, some recording the scene with their phones, others shaking their heads in disgust. Karen had thrived on controlling the narrative for so long. But this time, everyone was witnessing the truth with their own eyes. No more lies could hide what she and Tyler were doing. When the officers finally led them both away for questioning, Karen shrieked that I would regret this, that she would bring the HOA down on my head. But the words sounded hollow, stripped of the authority they once carried. The HOA itself had already started to distance from her, and now, with criminal charges looming, her credibility was nearly gone. Inside, I sat on the couch, shaking from the adrenaline, replaying the footage, over and over just to reassure myself that justice was finally being served. My lawyer called me the next morning, already aware of the situation from neighbors who had tipped him off. And he was more confident than ever about the restraining order and civil case. He told me Karen had crossed into territory where the law would no longer look the other way. She wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was a liability to the entire neighborhood. For once, I felt like the weight pressing on my chest was lifting. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her didn't go quietly. Even with charges, even with her lies exposed, there was always another move, another desperate attempt to claw back control. And as the days ticked by toward our court date, I couldn't help but wonder what her final act would look like. Because something told me the most explosive confrontation of all was still waiting ahead. The court date arrived with an intensity that felt like the climax of a movie, and as I walked into the courthouse that morning, I could feel the weight of months of harassment, false accusations, and trespassing pressing down on my shoulders. But I also carried with me evidence, witnesses, and the undeniable truth that Karen and her son had pushed too far. The courtroom was filled with neighbors who had grown tired of Karen's antics. Some there to testify, others just eager to see justice finally prevail. Karen sat across from me, her usual smug expression replaced with a tight, anxious glare, and beside her was Tyler, arms crossed, trying to look defiant, but clearly nervous under the judge's watchful eye. My lawyer presented everything. 911 call recordings, the video footage of Tyler trying to force the pool lock, the crowbar lying in the driveway, Karen screaming that I had stolen her property. The judge listened quietly, occasionally glancing at Karen with an expression. that seemed to grow more irritated with every new piece of evidence. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she launched into her performance, sobbing, claiming that I had privatized a community pool, that I was locking children out, and that she had simply been protecting her son's right to swim, but her theatrics fell flat. The judge interrupted more than once, warning her to stick to facts and stop weaving personal narratives. For the first time, it wasn't my word against hers, was reality laid bare, documented and undeniable. Ruling came swiftly. The judge granted my restraining order immediately, forbidding Karen and Tyler from coming within 100 feet of my property, the pool fence, or myself. On top of that, Karen was ordered to pay fines for harassment and trespassing, while Tyler was placed into a juvenile program to address his behavior before it spiraled further out of control. Karen's face twisted in rage, and she tried to argue, but the gavel came down hard, silencing her protests. The room erupted in quiet murmurs of satisfaction, and neighbors who had endured her tyranny for years looked relieved, some even smiling, as though a storm had finally passed. As we walked out of the courthouse, a few of them patted me on the shoulder, thanking me for standing up to her and setting a precedent that bullies like Karen couldn't control everything just because they screamed the loudest. Back at home, life slowly began to return to normal. The pool that had been a battlefield now felt like a sanctuary again. My daughter laughed as she splashed without fear of being interrupted or watched, and the smart lock clicked shut each night with a reassuring sense of safety. Still, I remained cautious, double-checking the cameras, keeping copies of every report and recording. Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily, and though the law had finally pinned her down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she would keep scheming, looking for loopholes or back doors to claw her way back into control. But for now at least, peace had returned, and it was a victory I wouldn't take lightly. Weeks later, I saw Karen briefly in passing as she drove out of the neighborhood, her eyes avoiding mine, her posture stiff and defensive. The aura of power she once carried seemed gone, replaced by the cold realization that her actions had cost her respect, money, and the very influence she prized so much. Tyler, too, was rarely seen outside anymore, and when he was, he avoided everyone's gaze, as though embarrassed by the chaos he and his mother had created. Neighbors started talking about recalling Karen from the HOA board entirely, stripping her of her last foothold of power. It was clear that her downfall wasn't just legal, it was social. She had burned too many bridges, and now she was isolated in the very community she had once ruled with intimidation. As I sat on my porch one evening watching the sunset reflect off the pool water, I thought back on everything that had happened, the fear, the stress, the endless confrontations, and I realized how important it was to stand up, to document, to fight back against injustice, even when it seemed easier to let it slide. Karen had called 911 on me more times than I could count, tried to twist every situation against me, and even weaponized her own son to invade my privacy. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. My story had become more than just a battle with one HOA tyrant. It was a reminder that bullies only win when you let them. And as I share this now, I want you to remember, if you've ever dealt with a Karen in your life, someone who thrives on control, manipulation, and intimidation, don't let them silence you. Fight back with facts, with persistence, with the courage to keep pushing until the truth comes out. Because no matter how loud the lies, the truth has a way of cutting through. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories of justice, resilience, and standing up against the impossible, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel. You won't want to miss what comes next.